Well, we are so grateful to welcome Dr. DeAngelis as our distinguished lecturer this evening. The Distinguished Lecture Series held by the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University invites our world's top thinkers to address our students, faculty, and the general public each month. During the lecture, please feel free to ask questions via the YouTube chat feature, and we'll ask them at the end of Dr. DeAngelis' lecture. Tonight, Dr. DeAngelis will speak on the issue, COVID-19 didn't break the public school system, it simply exposed the problems that already existed. Corey DeAngelis is an adjunct scholar at K12 Institute, the director of school choice at Reason Foundation, and the executive director at Educational Freedom Institute. He was named on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for his work on education policy and received the Buckley Award from America's Future in 2020. His research primarily focuses on the effects of school choice programs on non-academic outcomes, such as criminal activity, character skills, mental health, and political participation. He has co-authored or authored over 40 journal articles, book chapters, reports on education policy, and he is the co-editor of School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Educational Freedom. His research has been published in peer-reviewed academic articles such as Social Science Quarterly, School Effectiveness and School Improvement, Educational Review, Educational Research and Evaluation, and Peabody Journal of Education. His work has also been published in outlets such as The Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Post, and National Review. Corey received his PhD in educational policy from the University of Arkansas. He additionally holds a Bachelor of Business Administration and Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Texas at San Antonio. Dr. DeAngelis, we'll go ahead and get your video fired up here, and we'll turn over the lecture to you this evening. We can hear you. We just don't see you yet.
Hey, I'm trying to press start video, but it's okay. Now it's allowing me to.
All right. There
Perfect.
We go.
Thank you. I was getting cold feet. I was gonna ditch out on you guys. Just kidding. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you to the students for starting us off as well, and thank you to everyone in the audience who came to listen to me speak tonight. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of ground to cover, because a lot of nonsense has happened with the traditional public school system in the past year. And as the title suggests in tonight's talk, what I'm mostly going to talk about is, in the way that I've put it over the past year, is that COVID-19 didn't break the public school system. In a lot of ways, it was already broken. And the pandemic simply shone a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 public education in the United States, which is a massive, long-lasting, long-existing power imbalance between the public school monopoly and individual families. And there's a lot of examples of what has happened over the past year that highlights this reality. Families, for such a long time, have been essentially powerless when it comes to K-12 education, because we fund buildings regardless of the choice of the family, regardless of their satisfaction in the matter. And what we've seen this past year in particular, regardless of whether those institutions even open their doors for business. And that's the main problem here. It's one thing for a public school to continue to receive children's education dollars regardless of how well they do each year and regardless of how well they're doing with children's academics from year to year. But it's another conversation altogether for that same institution to continue receiving children's education dollars regardless of whether they open their doors for business. And families, luckily, thankfully at least, are looking at this massive power imbalance between the system and how they felt over the past year. And they're reevaluating one, the factory model of schooling itself, we've seen a jump in support for homeschooling and then a jump in the number of people homeschooling. It's over doubled since the spring already. The U.S. Census Bureau just put out data today, actually, suggesting that about 11% of households are homeschooling formally, not public school at home or remote learning, or can't even call it remote learning in a lot of places, remote instruction. Formal homeschooling has over doubled since the previous year. So a lot of people are reevaluating that. They're throwing their hands up when it comes to traditional public school system. But secondly, and more importantly almost, is that families are reevaluating how we fund K-12 education in the United States. As I said earlier, the current system, we fund a building regardless of how well it does and regardless of whether it opens its doors. But families have been scrambling over the past year, and rightfully so. What they're seeing is they're scrambling, running the private schools, having to pay out of pocket, essentially paying twice, paying out of the property tax system for the public school that's not even open, and then digging into their pockets this past year to pay for private school tuition, which for schools that are more than happy to open their doors for in-person instruction all across the country. And the families are looking at this situation and saying, well, if my grocery store doesn't reopen, I can take my money elsewhere. If the local Walmart reopened its stores for business for whatever reason, that didn't happen. But if it did, it would be kind of an inconvenience, but it wouldn't be devastating because that same family could take that money to Trader Joe's or another provider of the service. Same thing if you're using a taxpayer-funded initiative like food stamps. The food stamps don't go straight to one institution regardless of what it opens its stores for business. No, the family has a choice in the matter, and they have the opportunity to take that money to Trader Joe's or some other provider of the service. And the way that I put it is that with all of these other industries, from restaurants to food services to higher education to pre-K services to just about any industry in the United States and elsewhere, the funding follows the person instead of the institution. And so we didn't have a lot of these problems in the past year of businesses keeping their doors closed because they knew that families could take their money elsewhere. You saw daycares reopening, and you saw restaurants and even liquor stores reopening, but the K-12 public schools wouldn't reopen, even though substantial evidence suggests that schools are not consistent. There's no consistent link between reopening the schools at the K-12 level and community spread of the virus or COVID-19 hospitalization. So it's safe to do so. And the private schools were able to do it, but the public schools took the opposite approach in so many places. And the way that I like to point out the disparity here is that the private schools overall in general have been fighting to reopen, or they've been open for essentially the most part of the past year. In places like Kentucky, for example, private schools fought against the government for the right to reopen their doors for their families when Governor Beshear forced them to keep their doors closed. They took the fight all the way up to the Supreme Court, the private schools did. And in other places like Michigan and Ohio, similar legal actions were taken by the private schools out there, whereas in the same places, whenever the schools were closed, the teachers' unions were celebrating the decision in Kentucky and in other states. And if you look nationwide at the data, the private schools are just substantially more likely to open their doors for business over the past year. And that's pretty much common wisdom at this point. People understand that in the same towns, the private schools are just much more likely to reopen, and they've been fighting to reopen, whereas the public school teachers' unions have been fighting to remain closed. And I want to be clear here, this isn't a problem with the people in the system. It's not because the people in the private sector are inherently better than the people in the public sector. I don't think that one bit whatsoever. I don't think that the people in the private sector were more competent in adapting to the pandemic than the people in the public school. I don't think that one bit. I think the difference is one of incentives. One of these sectors receives children's education dollars regardless of whether they open their doors for business. So essentially anyone would do the same thing given that set of incentives that's baked into the public school system where you can stay home not have to commute to work, not have to provide the in-person childcare service, not have to be around children throughout the day, even though it's a low risk of the virus, and then keep your same benefits in terms of job security and pay. The calculus is different in that decision-making framework when you look at the public school system and when you look at private businesses and private schools, and if you look at the system of daycares throughout the United States as well. Another interesting story about how private schools took a different approach came out of California. California still has, most of the students don't have the option of full-time in-person instruction, even though they spend much more, 38% more than states like Florida that are essentially available for in-person instruction 5 days a week to all students. They spend about 38% more in California, but they do have much stronger teachers unions. But one private school in particular, a Catholic school in the Sacramento area, there was a weird, arbitrary regulation at the time in the Sacramento County health official had a regulation that daycares could open, but the schools couldn't open, public or private. So the public schools celebrated that decision and said, oh, well, we get the same pay no matter what. That doesn't mean they're bad people or that they wanted to do anything malevolent. It's just, hey, you get the same job security and you can keep your doors closed. Many businesses would do the same thing if they had that setup built into the system. But a private school, a Catholic school out in Sacramento, actually rebranded itself as a daycare to try to get around the arbitrary, ridiculous government regulations that said it was okay if you were not learning, but if you were learning and you're a school, if you call yourself a school, then it's not okay. And that just goes to show you how the private schools have a much different set of different calculus in their minds when it comes to whether they should reopen or not. And there's also been 4 studies that I know of on the topic. I know of all 4 studies on the topic because I was the first one to do a study on this topic. But all 4 studies that have looked at this question have found that places with stronger teachers unions, as far as the public schools in places with stronger teachers unions, are substantially less likely to reopen over the past year than places that have less powerful teachers unions, even after controlling for tons of demographic characteristics in the area, including COVID risk as measured by COVID cases per capita and deaths per capita, which in fact were not generally related statistically to the reopening decisions at the public school districts, which goes to show you it seems to be power and politics than safety and real concerns about the virus. We also found that the more political partisanship in the surrounding area was a strong predictor of reopening the schools in person. A few other studies have found this as well, and all 4 studies on the topic have found that places with stronger teachers unions, the public schools were less likely to reopen in person. Again, this seems to be more about politics and power dynamics than it really is about safety. There's a lot of evidence as well that suggests, so we have these studies have consistently found that there isn't a consistent link between the risk in the area as measured by cases and deaths per capita and the reopening decision, but that it was related to power and influence by the teachers unions and political partisanship. But we've also found that there's a ton of evidence now suggesting that school reopenings can be done safely, and that there's even new evidence out most recently in CDC guidance suggesting that 3 feet social distancing is not statistically different from 6 feet of social distancing. That's based on a new peer-reviewed study. I think Emily Oster from Brown University was one of the authors on that study, but it's been accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, suggesting that the schools can reopen even with 3 feet of social distancing, not 6 feet of social distancing. But the preponderance of the evidence, as laid out by the CDC and other researchers as well, suggests that school reopenings generally are not consistently related to major community transmission or hospitalization. So just some examples of some of this evidence. You have the CDC report published by CDC researchers in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA. It's a top peer-reviewed journal in the field, suggesting that, again, the preponderance of the evidence suggests it's safe to reopen schools. You also have John Bailey, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I think this is the latest review of the evidence that exists on the topic. He collected 130 different studies on the topic, suggesting that schools can safely reopen for in-person instruction. That's a huge meta-analysis of the preponderance of the evidence. It's not just cherry-picking one study here or there, but looking at the vast body of the evidence. We also have statements coming out from Dr. Fauci on national television. Some people like Dr. Fauci, some people don't. Take it for what it is, but he has recently said that we should close the bars and open the schools, and that data suggests that the spread among children and from children is not very high at all, or that it's very low. So I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along those lines. And if you just look at the positivity rates in the schools versus the positivity rates in the overall community, Brown University has been tracking this for months and months. If you just Google the Brown University COVID response dashboard, you'll find what I'm talking about. They've looked at this over time, and Emily Oster, the economist over there at Brown University, has been writing about this. In The Atlantic, for example, I think she first wrote about this with the headline, "Schools Aren't Super Spreaders." And then she later on wrote in Washington Post with the headline, something along the lines of, "Schools can safely reopen. This new data makes the case." But this data has consistently found that the positivity rates in the schools are about 1/10 or even less than in the overall community. Here's one example. The most recent data that I've seen, it must have been earlier this month, actually, from New York City, which has opened a good amount of its elementary schools, at least. They've done an extensive amount of testing in the schools in New York City, and then obviously in the overall community. And they've found consistently that the positivity rates in the schools in New York City is only around 0.5%. And the latest data is about 0.5 to 0.55%. Whereas in the overall community, it's about 7% positivity rate, suggesting that the schools are not major contributors of community transmission. With the positivity rate is less than 1/10 in the schools than it is in the overall community. You have data from UNICEF, the United Nations, a report of over 190 different countries suggesting that there's no consistent link between reopening schools and overall community transmission. And if you want, I can add the links to these reports a little later on. You could also look at my congressional testimony where I've cited all of this evidence. There's a ton of evidence now that we have suggesting that schools can safely reopen. If you just Google kids in the age of COVID, Corey DeAngelis, congressional testimony, you'll find my full 15 to 20 pages of congressional written testimony that cites all of this evidence. And then I continue by also pointing out that these schools have been closed because people were looking at one side of the equation based on fear mongering, not so much about what the data said, because there wasn't a lot of data. And at first, maybe it was okay to keep the schools closed if you didn't have much information. But over time, we started getting a lot of data from places like Sweden that kept its schools open, and they found over there that it was okay to keep the schools open. And then also just looking at how the private schools have been open and other businesses and daycares have been open, why wasn't it okay for the schools to reopen? Even without that data, just seeing how other industries were able to do it on the ground suggested that this was a bad idea to keep the schools closed from the very get-go. But now we have tons of data suggesting they could reopen safely. But people were doing this, at least at first, in the first couple of weeks at least, because they were looking at one side of the equation. And that side of the equation was, what are the risks of reopening schools? But they were leaving out the entire other side of the equation, which is, what are the risks of not giving families the option of in-person instruction? And what we've found now, so we have tons of data suggesting that this wasn't a huge problem, but now we have a ton of data now suggesting that on the other side of the equation, keeping the schools closed has led to a lot of real and serious problems for millions of children all across the country. And so one of the layers of that onion is that there's been a massive amount of learning loss when it comes to K-12 education, particularly for the least advantaged in our communities. There's a couple of studies out now by McKinsey and Company using nationwide data suggesting that their first report, they estimated that the learning loss accrued to children already was about 3 months on average of learning loss that has increased to, I want to say, 8 or 9 months of learning loss. It's been a ridiculous amount of slide when it comes to children losing ground academically, according to this study. And then if you don't want to look at the nationwide study because you want to look at individual school districts, there's tons of data. Whenever a school district puts out a report about their grades relative to the previous year, that when they had in-person instruction, the percentage of students failing multiple classes has gone up a lot. For example, in my area, I live here in DC, Fairfax County Public Schools in Virginia was one of the first districts to report this information. And the Washington Post thankfully reported on these data as well, but they published data from their school district finding that the percentage of students failing 2 or more classes relative to the previous school year increased by 83%. And I believe that number for students with special needs has increased by even a larger amount, by over doubling, 111%. So you had all of these horror stories coming out from all of these different school districts finding that failing grades have gone up everywhere. We've seen data come out of Houston, Texas. We've seen data come out of St. Paul, Minnesota, Arlington Public Schools in Virginia. All across the country, we've just seen more and more learning loss. We have data from OECD. Eric Hanishek, a Stanford economist, and his co-author put out a report towards the beginning of this, I believe it was either fall or spring of 2020. They estimated that the economic losses associated with the learning losses that had already probably been accrued would amount in the long term, the net present value of those losses in the US alone would be about $14 trillion in economic losses from reduced productivity that is associated with better learning outcomes for. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these losses associated with keeping the schools closed. We've also seen more, what I would call even more deleterious effects of keeping the schools closed. And it's stuff that I don't like to touch on very much, even though I've looked at it when it comes to some of my studies when it comes to school choice, is that keeping the schools closed has not only hurt children academically, but it's hurt them mentally when it comes to risk of suicide going up. There's a study from China that's peer-reviewed. I can share the study soon, but it's also in my congressional testimony that since the schools closed, the number of children reporting that they attempted suicide and thought about suicide had gone up in a statistically significant fashion. And then you have examples from the U.S. as well. Clark County Public School, which is the 5th largest school district in the nation in Nevada, their number of students that actually did commit suicide in the first 9 months of the school year had doubled relative to the previous year. So these are real problems that people, and I don't think anybody thought about this when they kept the schools closed. I'm not saying that people in the public school system did this on purpose. No one is arguing that at all. It's just that these things weren't considered. These are unintended consequences associated with keeping the schools closed. So we have that example from Clark County Public Schools. I believe Erica Green at the New York Times did a great story about that phenomena. They did end up opening their schools after that data had come out in Clark County Public Schools. They started giving families more options for in-person learning after that. But we do have substantial evidence of parents also reporting, sorry about that they've had more problems with their children. A Pew Research survey, which is also in my testimony, has surveyed families nationwide, and they're consistently reporting that their children are having more problems emotionally and mentally associated with keeping the schools closed and not having the option for in-person instruction. So there's a ton of costs associated, and there's a lot of other things that people, it's like not even thinking about the students themselves. There's other broader societal impacts. And one of the things is that there are inequities that have been exacerbated. Advantaged families have been able to at least be more likely to dig into their pockets to pay for private school tuition and fees out of pocket and get that in-person instruction that works. They've been more likely to be able to pick their bags and move up to Florida to places that have public schools open for in-person instruction. They've been more likely to be able to afford the cost associated with home-based education and adequate remote learning. They've been more likely to form things that people are starting to call pandemic pods, or what people historically have called micro schools, where 5 to 10 children get together in a household and families kind of get together to economize and outsource the process of homeschooling to make it more economically feasible. So this has led to societal inequities as well from keeping the schools closed. And in a sense, the whole school reopening debate has been a debate about whether the least advantaged should have the option of in-person instruction, because the most advantaged already do have the option one way or another to get an adequate education this past year. Doesn't mean it's not hard for them, but that is overall leading to inequities on a large scale. But there are also other unintended consequences. The Economist has recently reported, based on recent evidence that's emerging, finding that there has been a decrease in participation in the labor force, disproportionately. They're disproportionately finding that females are more likely to be leaving the labor force and not returning over the past year, because overall, on average, they're more likely to be returning to the households to provide some base of some type of childcare activities, whereas that would have typically been outsourced to the schools in previous years. So there's these other effects that are it's a multi-layer of negative effects that a lot of people just didn't think about. And there's probably other things that we haven't thought about as well that we won't see for years to come. I've gone over a ton of evidence about how it seems like it's been safe to reopen the schools. But there's a lot of other things that happened over the past year that made people kind of just sit there a second and say, like, oh, well, this doesn't really add up. This doesn't pass the sniff test. What's going on here? That in a way, a lot of these other things were more powerful in arguments to reopen the schools because they were just absurd on their face. I'll give you a couple of examples. The first example is, it's easy without the data suggesting scientifically that it's easy to reopen the schools or that it can be done. As I pointed out earlier, you could just point to other sectors and say, well, the private schools did it, the daycares did it, grocery stores did it, all these other private businesses did it. Why couldn't the public schools do it? There's also elements of hypocrisy that have come out in the past year on the part of the teachers unions. And so a couple of examples about that. And a lot of people on the call or on the presentation have probably heard about this one because it's one of the biggest forms of hypocrisy, is that there was a Chicago Teachers Union board member vacationing in Puerto Rico while at the same time as they were sitting poolside tweeting out about why their members shouldn't return to work in person back in Chicago. And a lot of people saw that as hypocritical because it begged the question, if it's safe enough to travel and vacation in person, well, then why isn't it safe enough to return to work in person? And I think the obvious answer there is because, well, it's fun to go to vacation in person. It's not fun to go back to work for some people in person. And that doesn't mean that those people have ill intentions. Again, it's just people prefer to do some things over another. You have the same people saying that they can't return to work in person, going to grocery stores and shopping in person. Well, if it wasn't safe to go back to work and teach in person, why was it safe enough to go back and shop in person in other places? Especially when children have been found to be less risky than the adult population when it comes to spreading and transmitting the virus. We also had a Berkeley Teachers Union president railing against reopening schools for in-person instruction, but then sending his own kid to in-person instruction at a private school, which is fine. I think every family should have access to a private school if that's the best option for them. Every family should do the best for their children, the best that they can. But it's hypocritical. Why is it okay? Why is it not okay to have your members return to work in person, but then it is okay to send your own child to in-person instruction in a private setting and where other people are working? One of the weirdest things that popped out to me, and this was when I first saw this was in Gilbert, Arizona, the first school district that I I was like, this cannot be. There's no way that this is actually happening. Once I put a spotlight on this, it'll just reverse. This is just so absurd that it's just never going to happen anywhere else. I was wrong. They continued to do it, and other school districts followed all across the country. But what was happening was the same school districts that were saying, well, it's not safe enough to return to in-person instruction, but so we're going to reopen for fully remote instruction. We're not going to do the in-person things because it's not safe enough to have the kids in the schools. But then opening the same school buildings for in-person childcare services, and they were charging families out of pocket in addition to what the families were already paying for that school system through the property tax system. So families were essentially a form of extortion on the part of the public school system, because they kept that initial payment and they said, oh, we're not going to give you that. You're not going to give your property taxes back. But hey, if you really do want our services that we would have provided essentially any other year, pay us again out of pocket, essentially getting double the revenues from these families. And what was weird to me was I started to question, well, why did they have to charge families out of pocket? Was it really just a racket where they wanted to get twice the amount of funding for doing the same amount of work? It actually wasn't that. That was my first thought, like, okay, yeah, maybe they're just profiting off of this, and it seems like a really icky thing to do. And in some places, by the way, this was up to $400 per child per week in some places. So this was a ton of money. Again, who's the most likely to be able to afford that? Who's the least likely to be able to afford that? Which goes to show you again that this has really led to a lot of inequities over the past year. But what they were doing was they were opening the same school buildings, and the public sector employees were going home and providing the remote instruction from home. And then private sector employees from places like YMCA and other outlets were more than happy to come into the public school buildings and provide those same in-person childcare services. But now what you're stuck with is you have two people doing the job of one, essentially. Now you had to pay both of the people. So the families had to pay those private sector employees out of pocket. And a lot of that is because of the incentives, again, that are baked into the public school system, where one of the groups of employees were able to go home and continue getting paid the same amount. And that's great for the employees in both sectors. No one's arguing with that. But the problem here is that the families got the short end of the stick. The people for which the school system is designed got the worst deal out of the last year. And I would say this has been happening for a long time. It's not just the past year. As I said in the title, is that this kind of situation really showed the problems that have existed for a very long time, and in a lot of ways, the public system was already broken. It just took a pandemic and the reluctance of the school system to even open its doors for business to really make families have a light switch go off in their head to figure out that, a lot of these things just don't make sense on their face. And there was a lot of other things as well that happened. For example, we continued putting more and more money into federal relief. We had the $13 billion in the CARES Act that was first allocated. That was a pretty substantial sum of money, most of which still has not been spent I believe it was allocated in the spring of 2020. And then in December 2020, the federal government, Congress allocated another $54 billion to K12 education in addition to the $13 billion through the CARES Act, both of which the vast majority of the funding still has not been spent. And then most recently, Congress passed the latest stimulus, which was, you thought the $67 billion that was already allocated was a lot, times about $128 billion were allocated in the latest stimulus through Congress. And the whole argument for this additional $123 billion, or $128 billion on that amount, which, just to put this in perspective, I can say it's a lot of money, and that might just go over people's head because Congress spends a ton of money all the time. But this is about the amount that the U.S. dedicated towards building Europe through the Marshall Plan after World War II in real terms after adjusting for inflation. And that's just the latest piece of this, the $128 billion that was just allocated. That's aside from what we already spend on K-12 public education. That's aside from the $67 billion that was already allocated. So this is a ton of money. And the whole argument for this was, well, we don't have enough resources to open the schools was the argument, which I called baloney on that from the start, because the Catholic schools have been open in so many places, which tend to be less well-funded, at least if you look at their tuition levels, a lot lower than what we spend in the public schools. Public schools in America spend about $15,424 per child per year. If you don't count the federal stimulus bills, it's going to be a lot whenever that data comes out. I'm not going to give you a number because I don't know what it's going to be. But we have increased that amount by 280% in real terms after adjusting for inflation since 1960. And each and every decade, we've thrown more and more money at the problem in public schools, whereas they've been less likely to reopen. In the private schools, which from what the two latest analyses that I've seen on this topic, well, it's clear that the tuition levels in private schools are lower, but then other analyses that have come out in the past couple of years have suggested nationwide, on average, private schools have less total funding than public schools on average. So that's one thing that didn't make sense to me, especially looking at the Catholic schools, which were able to do it, but then the public or the government-run schools weren't able to do it. Another thing that didn't make sense was no one was doing any studies relating funding to the reopening status of the schools. You would think that the school districts that had more money and more surpluses, maybe they'd be able to be more likely to reopen their doors for in-person instruction. But as I pointed out earlier, the first thing that came to my mind was, well, Florida only spends $10,700 per student per year, which is about 29% less than the national average. And essentially all their schools are open for full-time in-person instruction. But then you have places like California that spend 38% more and have stronger teachers unions, where the vast majority of students don't have the option of full-time in-person instruction. So that didn't pass the sniff test for me as well. But then I gathered data from MCH Strategic Data, which reports the reopening status of public school districts for over 12,000 public school districts across the nation. They've been updating this pretty frequently. And then I also collected data from the federal government and tried to do a regression on, well, let's look at the school district, how much the school district spends, and whether they reopen for in-person instruction. I co-authored with Christos Makrides, who's affiliated with MIT on the study. He's better at the methods than I am. But we did a whole bunch of different statistical tests, throwing in different, household income, the political partisanship in the area, the teachers union power in the area, the COVID risk in the area, the age and race distributions in the area, a whole bunch of different demographic characteristics, and added a little bit of them to each of the different models over time in the tables. And we could not find any evidence that funding was related to the likelihood of reopening schools for in-person instruction. Yet you had the teachers unions over and over again saying that this was all about money. And looking back at it, for a lot of people, I think they're saying that this was probably used in some way or another as a bargaining chip in order to get more money from the federal government so that they can have more staff, which leads to more teachers union dues and a stronger voting bloc by having more political power, which is great for teachers union bosses, but not so much for students. And we could not find any statistically significant evidence to suggest that relationship. But in some models, we actually found the opposite, that if anything, the school districts that were more well-funded were the school districts that were remote. If anything, in some models, were more well-funded than their in-person counterparts. And within a week of when we released our study, Georgetown University economist, I believe she's an economist, Dr. Marguerite Rosa, and her team released a similar analysis. And they looked at school districts that went remote versus in-person, kind of like what we did. And they also found separately that in general, what they were finding was that the remote districts this year were estimated to have budget surpluses relative to their in-person counterparts. Again, suggesting that if anything, the school districts that kept their doors closed were more likely to have extra money left over than the in-person schools. And one example of this is Los Angeles public schools. They've mostly opted to keep their doors shut over the past year, and they were estimated to have about a $500 million budget surplus in the latest school year. So it doesn't seem like it's about money. And one other thing that just didn't make sense to me, that suggested that this wasn't really about money, it was more about politics and power dynamics than anything, was that there was, with this latest stimulus bill of $128 billion, one of the senators, I believe he's from Missouri, last name of Blunt, it might be Roy Blunt if I'm getting his name incorrectly. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I believe that's correct, introduced an amendment that would have made this additional 123 or 128 billion dollars in stimulus funding that's meant for the reopening of schools, conditional upon those schools actually reopening their doors for in-person instruction. I mean, that makes sense. And even went on to add to the amendment that it would be conditional upon reopening the schools for in-person instruction, given that all of the teachers were vaccinated. Congress could not pass that amendment. And so they've approved $128 billion additional dollars to go to the K12 education system, regardless of whether the school is even open, even if the teachers are vaccinated, even if all the teachers are vaccinated. The Senate blocked it on a 50-50 party line vote. 50-50 votes aren't going to cut it with an amendment. You have to have 51 votes in the Senate in order to get an amendment passed. So it failed to pass. And but if the money is meant for reopening the schools in person, then why couldn't that amendment pass? Why not make the money contingent upon reopening the schools if it's for reopening the schools? So that's another thing that for a lot of people just, well, that doesn't make sense now, does it? And then another thing that didn't really make sense was that recently the Congressional Budget Office, looking at that same stimulus funding, estimated that only 5% of the $128 billion would be spent in the 2021 school year. So if the $128 billion is supposed to be meant for reopening schools in person now, or in the first 100 days of the presidency, then why would 95% of up to 95% of the funding be spent after the pandemic? Well, maybe because it's not all that much about reopening the schools for in-person instruction. Maybe a lot of this whole conversation from the get-go has been about politics and power dynamics more so than it's been about real concerns about the virus and the needs of individual students and their families all across the country. So these are just some of the things over the past year that haven't added up. And these are some of the, I had to point out a lot of the losses that we're actually seeing with millions of families all across the country right now when it comes to students losing ground academically, mentally, even physically. The Wall Street Journal reported recently a lot of quotes from pediatricians suggesting that in the past year, they've seen elementary school students gaining 20 to 30 pounds in the past year, elementary school students. So this inactivity has led to these other physical problems as well. Not for everyone, obviously, but just looking at overall trends, this is what we're seeing being associated with keeping the school shut. I've gone over a lot of negative things in this discussion, but I want to go over some optimism that I have and what I will call maybe perhaps the only silver lining of the entire past year has been something I alluded to earlier, that families are kind of waking up and saying, you know what, this doesn't make sense. And since they've been hurting so much over the past year in so many ways, families are looking at this situation, and even if they usually like their public schools, are saying, I don't want to ever be in this position again. They don't want to feel helpless any longer. And so what they're looking at is things like what I call funding students as opposed to institutions, or what most people refer to as school choice, which I have previously referred to in my co-edited volume. I didn't name it funding students instead of systems. I named it with my co-editor, School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. If you want to go check it out, it's at the Cato Institute, co-edited by my colleague, Neil McCluskey over at the Cato Institute, if you want to check that out. But families are in like never before are supporting the concept of funding students directly in the form of things like education savings accounts. The latest nationwide polling on this from Real Clear Opinion Research, for example, found that in just a few months, the percentage of families supporting school choice options has jumped by 10 percentage points from April 2020 being at about 67% to August of 2020, having that number jump to about 77%, which is about a 15% relative increase. If you're looking at it in terms of relative increases off the base. So it's a huge spike in the support in a very short amount of time. And that was among families who had their children in the public school system, a group that's typically less likely to support funding students directly. And if you look at overall in the general public, particularly when you're looking at parents of public school, of K through 12 school age students, the numbers more so around 80% or higher. One survey recently finding that 86% of families supported funding students directly through an education savings account. And really quickly, what that means is that the funding that would have gone to your traditional public school, a substantial portion of that funding would follow the student to wherever they're getting an education. It would go through an education savings account for that child directed by the family for only government approved education expenditures, which could be used at private school tuition and fees like a traditional voucher, but it could also be used for non-private school tuition type of expenses such as home-based learning, curriculum, could be used for micro schools and pandemic pods. It can even be used for special needs educational therapies. And it really takes us from school choice to education choice in a way, since all of the funding can be used for any approved education expenditure. And the money follows the child instead of the institution. And that's why I like to talk about it in those terms. And we already do this with so many other taxpayer funded initiatives, even when we're talking about education. Let's think about higher education. We have something called the Pell Grant for low income students and the GI Bill for veterans. That money doesn't go straight to a particular government-run residentially assigned institution. It goes to the student, right? So the student can say, I'll take it to the public provider if I want, but they can also take it to the community college if they want, but they could also take it to a private religious or non-religious university of their choosing if they would like. Same thing with pre-K programs. With pre-K programs, including the federal Head Start program, the funding doesn't go to a residentially assigned government-run pre-K provider. Instead, rightfully so, the money goes to the families, and the families can choose public or private providers of pre-K services, religious or non-religious providers of pre-K services. The funding follows the student instead of going to one geographically assigned government-run monopoly. Same thing with food stamps. We don't tell low-income families that they must use their food stamps at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. And most people would think that that would be absolutely ridiculous. It's similarly absolutely ridiculous that in the current system, we residentially assign families to public schools, and we residentially assign that funding to go to that school regardless of the family's choice in this past year, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, especially when you start looking at these other programs. With the food stamps, it goes to the family, and families can choose Walmart, Safeway, Trader Joe's, or any provider of the service that works for them. And that's how we should do it and apply the same logic when it comes to K-12 education. We do the same thing with Medicaid dollars. Medicaid dollars can be used at private hospitals, religious or non-religious hospitals of the individual's choosing. We do the same thing with Section 8 housing vouchers. The money follows the decision of the individual family. And you can go on and on and on with these examples of other initiatives that are funded by taxpayers, where the funding follows the decision of the individual family instead of protecting a special interest. And what's interesting to me in particular is that a lot of the same people who support funding students directly when it comes to higher education and pre-K, they get all up in arms only when it comes to the K-12 years, the in-between years. And the only difference there is that choice is the norm for the most part when it comes to higher education, and choice is also the norm when it comes to pre-K. But choice threatens an entrenched special interest that gets your children's education dollars regardless of your choice in the matter, regardless of your satisfaction with how well they do, and regardless, as we've seen this past year, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. So that special interest fights really hard against allowing those dollars to go anywhere else. And that is, again, the incentive that's baked into the system. I don't really blame the individuals that are fighting against any change to the system, but I am going to call them out for being logically inconsistent for supporting taxpayer funds going to people with all of these other programs, but not when it threatens their monopoly. That's a problem that I'm always going to call out, and it's a reason that the other side is going to continue to lose the ideological debate and ideological battle when it comes to funding students as opposed to institutions. There's no good reason to fund closed buildings when you can fund students directly instead. And as I've said, there's that one Real Clear Opinion Research poll finding the surge in support. And then two, we've also seen a support by nationwide poll by Morning Consult, an independent third party, finding surges in support since last year for public charter schools, tax credit scholarship programs, voucher programs, and education savings accounts. Essentially, every single type of quote unquote school choice that there is in the United States, we've seen upticks in support for all of those different types of school choice in the survey. And we've also found that families are fighting back in other ways. So they're supporting these alternatives, and legislators actually at the state level have introduced bills to fund students as opposed to systems. At least 29 states now, Texas being the most recent, have legislators that have introduced bills, mostly in the form of education savings accounts, to fund students as opposed to these closed institutions. And about a third of those states, I want to say about 11 now, have passed at least one of these bills out of a chamber, either the Senate or the House, and a handful, about 5 others, have passed these bills out of at least one committee. Some states have passed out of both committees, for example, or both chambers. For example, West Virginia had a very expansive proposal of an education savings account, which would be available to over 93% of the school-age population in the first year, would be eligible to apply for these funds. And that passed with wide margins in both their House and Senate, and the governor is expected to sign it this week. Maybe he signed it now. I have to check my Twitter, but I don't have time for that right now. But maybe he signed it today, but he's expected to sign it this week. And it's one of the most expansive school choice programs in the nation. And so this is groundbreaking in West Virginia. And we're seeing this traction pick up speed at the state level in these other states as well. Families are fighting back with lawsuits as well. If you've seen in Arlington Public Schools, there's been lawsuits. There have been lawsuits in there's a nationwide lawsuit against the teachers unions as well. Families are saying either give us the chance to reopen to have in-person instruction, or let me have that money and take it to another alternative like a private school or let me use it to fund home-based instruction if I so choose. Just today, as I pointed out earlier, the proportion of families homeschooling, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, has over doubled to about over 11%, according to their survey. And they distinguish between homeschooling and public schooling at home or some other form of remote schooling. They make it clear in the survey that it's formal homeschooling. There have been school board recalls that are in effect. I believe there's one in the Denver area as well, and it might be called Douglas County, where there's an initiative to recall, I want to say 4 of the school board members out there. And we've seen this action in Idaho and other states as well, where the families are really fighting back. And that gives me some optimism going forward with all of the negative things that have happened over the past year and all the nonsense that has happened over the past year. The silver lining here is that, in a way, the teachers unions have done more to advance the concept of school choice than anyone could have ever imagined in the past year. And in a way, they've also overplayed their hand by keeping schools closed. There's one other study that's coming out tomorrow I want to leave you guys with to give you a little sneak peek. The author gave me the thumbs up to share this finding. He's Ben Scafferty from Kennesaw State University. Did this analysis using data from private schools across the nation. And the reason that this study needed to be done was that some people were saying, well, the public schools, yes, they're staying remote, but that's because they're doing what the families want, despite all the families having troubles over the past year and saying that they want to keep to reopen the schools at larger percentages than what is open and available to families for full-time in-person instruction. I think the latest survey that I saw was about from Gallup nationwide, came out pretty recently, 79% of parents with school-age children in the US want full-time in-person instruction for their children right now, which is much higher than the amount of full-time in-person instruction that's available. I believe only about a third, or about 30% of public schools offer full-time in-person instruction across the United States right now. So that disconnect suggests that this isn't the decisions of the public schools aren't aligning with families. It's more aligned with what the private schools are providing. But then there haven't been a lot of formal studies on this. So one study from Wisconsin found that school districts that went fully remote lost more enrollment than school districts that did not go fully remote and had some type of in-person instruction available, either through a hybrid or a full-time in-person instruction model, which suggests that families are voting with their feet away from school districts that chose to go fully remote, and they're picking private and homeschool options. So that was the first data that I've seen on that by Will Flanders in Wisconsin. But this one that's coming out tomorrow, hopefully it comes out tomorrow, but I got permission from the author, had an analysis of a couple hundred private schools, and they found that public school districts that chose to go remote, or private schools with public school districts in the area that chose to go fully remote, were more likely to see enrollment increases. So again, this is additional evidence from outside of Wisconsin through the rest of the country, finding that families are voting with their feet in places where the public schools aren't opening their doors to the private schools that have their doors open for in-person instruction, which again is more evidence suggesting that the public schools got it wrong in so many places. Not everywhere. A lot of public schools have been open. But overall, this is in general what we're seeing across the nation. And that's the main takeaway from that study. I think it's a rigorous study. It's a great study that will probably make some headlines tomorrow when they get it up online. Again, suggesting that families want something else. And look, they're also voting with their feet out of the public school system in large numbers all across the country. The latest data that I've seen was reported by Chalkbeat, a news source. I think they had data for 33 different states, finding that on average, depends on the state, some states were bigger than others, but the enrollment losses in the public school system were about 3 to 5%. And that means that they're going to lose a lot of money because public schools in large part are funded based on the amount of students that they have enrolled. So 3 to 5% nationwide, that's millions of students leaving the public school system, which means billions of dollars that the public school system can lose. And, unfortunately, a lot of that was caused by their own doing, by choosing to keep the public schools closed. Again, the teachers unions have kind of overplayed their hand by keeping the schools closed, and maybe they didn't anticipate that families were going to flock out of the school system. And this is without these school choice bills passing. Families are pulling their kids out even without school choice bills in place. But again, not all families have that opportunity. So if we fund students directly, more families will have options to access to these types of alternatives as well. We might even see a larger reduction in the proportion of students in the traditional public school system nationwide than the 3 to 5% that we've been seeing in so many states. So that's, I think we should open it up to questions. I've been talking for about an hour, but I want to thank you, Jeff, for the kind introduction. And I want to thank the Centennial Institute for having me out to talk with you guys today. I want to thank the audience for checking this out. But the main takeaway here is, look, a lot of this has been more about politics and power dynamics than real concerns about safety and the needs of future generations of children and their families. And the other big takeaway is that families are seeing that this is messed up and they don't want to feel powerless anymore. So they're seeking alternatives and fighting back. And the silver lining here is that families might just push the system over the edge to fight for funding students as opposed to systems. And we may see more educational freedom for years to come. Thank you.
Dr. DeAngelis, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm rearing to go because I got a lot of questions. We've got a lot of questions here because this is something that is really, really critical. It's a top issue at the Centennial Institute. when we look at the problems with government-run education, I appreciated the fact you used that term, because within education, you have your traditional brick and mortar public schools, your neighborhood schools. You also have charter schools, which are funded by the government, but have more parent leadership when it comes to the schools. And then you have your private schools and you have your homeschooling. But I want to go back a little bit. I want to talk about what happened to education in this country, because it has changed a lot. Ben Sass gets into this in his book about kind of the John Dewey model of public education, the idea of putting education in the hands of experts, taking parents out of the equation, putting kids into the hands of experts so that they can best educate the kids, having a common education for America's school children. But it really kind of started to fall apart. The quality of education, the rise of really, I think a lot of conservatives don't put their kids into government-run schools because of the indoctrination that happens through curriculum, special interest groups, Planned Parenthood, ACLU, the role that they have in government-run schools, and parents saying, I don't want to be a part of that. So they're looking for alternatives. So can you give us just kind of an overview of what happened to government-run education in this country? Because I graduated from government-run schools. I could see them start to shift. I graduated high school in 2000. You could start to see the shift in curriculum happening now, but it seems like things have really changed from where government-run schools were back in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah, I too attended government-run schools all through my K-12 education. So if I made any mistakes tonight in anything that I said, that's probably some of the problems. I blame my K-12 education for that. But I think you're right as well to call it government schools as opposed to public schools. And this is something that I've said long before, is that public schools, quote unquote, public schools aren't really public in any meaningful sense of the word. They're not a public good by the economic definition. They're excludable and rivalrous in consumption, but then they're not open to the public like a public park per se, where anybody can go and use a particular public park that they stroll by. But with quote unquote public schools, they discriminate against children by zip code. If you don't live in the right place, you can't attend a particular quote unquote public school. So since they're discriminatory in their admissions, and also in magnet schools, they can explicitly have selective admissions on things other than geography as well, which they're defined as quote unquote public schools, which they're not open to the public. But then also these schools are run by the government. They're regulated by the government. They're funded by the government or the taxpayer. They are compelled by the government. They're assigned by the government. The correct term is government schools, more so than public schools. But then also to get to the heart of your question is that there's a lot of things that have happened over time in American education as well. We've started to focus on things other than basic math and reading skills, and we've gotten a lot of political indoctrination that's gone on for far too long in recent years in the country. And I want to say, I think another silver lining here is that families got to see this. Remote learning was horrible in so many ways, but families started to see what was going on in their public school classrooms. And a lot of them said, well, hey, I don't really like what's going on. And they posted it on social media and things have gone viral because families, again, this is just fueling the fire of families, particularly conservative families, that are saying, like, I don't really like what's being taught in my school, or maybe I don't like how it's being taught, or maybe it's just, the teacher in one example didn't know what the Electoral College was, for example. I think they called the Electoral College a kind of a secret society or something, just not getting the facts right as well. But the big backlash that, in my view, has been people seeing the political nonsense going on in the classroom. And so that's another reason why families are pushing for things like school choice, so that they can have some type of alternative to access that doesn't have as much of that going on. And I will say, the monopoly is fought to keep itself propped up every step of the way. Even when schools first shut down in March of 2020, You had the Oregon Teachers Union lobbying to the government to make it illegal to switch to virtual public charter schools because families were saying, oh man, the public schools haven't been doing remote learning. The government runs schools and they might not be able to do it really quickly. They might not be able to do a good job at it. Hey, these virtual public charter schools are open for business. They've been doing this for decades. Any other year, I'd be able to pull my kid out of the traditional school and send them to the charter school. But then the Oregon Teachers Union lobbied to make it illegal to switch because they wanted to protect their monopoly. They didn't want to lose the funding associated with their students. And the Wall Street Journal reported on this. If you just Google Oregon Wall Street Journal Teachers Union, you'll find it. Thousands of families were blocked from switching to their adequate remote instruction at the worst time possible. The union sought to protect itself at the expense of families at the worst time possible. We saw similar actions in Pennsylvania and California, where the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators lobbied for the same thing. They didn't get exactly the same thing. It was technically legal to switch to the virtual charter schools, but none of the money would follow the child to the charter school. So it was economically infeasible, even if it was technically okay to do. But at first they did lobby to make it illegal. So we saw this kind of rent seeking happening on the part of the teachers unions and other unions at the beginning of the pandemic. And we've seen this over time as well. Anytime there's a charter school proposal or any of these proposals to fund students as opposed to closed buildings, the loudest opponents are the teachers unions and administrators unions. They fight really hard and they repeat these myths that don't hold up to any scrutiny over and over again, even if they're horrible arguments that don't stand up to the data or the basic logic of the arguments, because they want to protect their monopoly as much as possible. And another thing that hasn't really helped is that they've lobbied for more money to the public school system. I mentioned earlier that in real terms, after adjusting for inflation since 1960, we've increased per pupil education expenditures by 280% in the United States. In DC, in my area, they spend over $31,000 per student per year on the traditional public schools out here. The charter schools they get like 2/3 of that funding, and the private school voucher program out here in DC, which is limited to maybe about 1,000 students. Those students from low-income families only get about $9,000 relative to the traditional public schools, which spend over 3 times the amount. And then when a study comes out finding that the kids using the voucher program get about the same math and reading test score outcomes and much higher satisfaction and safety outcomes, the mainstream media will sometimes call that a loss because it didn't significantly increase math and reading test score outcomes. And they'll often, particularly the teachers unions, fail to report the positive effects on safety and satisfaction. They'll leave out the fact that the voucher students were funded about 1/3 of the amount of what they spend in the public schools. But since we've increased funding over time so much in the traditional public school system, it becomes harder and harder for private schools to compete with the quote unquote free alternative, which costs more and more money every year. One way to level the playing field is, again, we're spending the $15,000 per student in the public schools. Give families some portion of that, maybe $10,000. Save the taxpayers some money. Give some of the money back to the public school district as well. Have a win-win-win situation, but give families the choice to take some of that money to a private school or some other alternative, and we might see the private school market flourish more than it has been over the past couple of decades. I think only about 8 or 9% of the K-12 public school population is currently in a private school. And I think the trend has been pretty flat over time. And if anything, it's been going down a little bit over the past decade. And that might have something to do with the fact that the public schools have gotten more and more powerful when it comes to having more and more money allocated to their system. But that doesn't mean we haven't had progress on the school choice front as well. Particularly this year, things can change, and we could put the power finally in the hands of the families rather than the system.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting to is really a key next step for our state, for our nation. If we can get to a place where we're putting the funding behind students as opposed to buildings, and institutions, you're going to see really thousands of flowers blooming when it comes to education. You're going to see better competition. You see better incentives. You're an economist. Do you understand that? Thomas Sowell understood. That's why he was such an advocate for charter schools. I've often said that there's this kind of magic pixie dust that happens between 12th grade and 13th grade, where all of a sudden you can take the government money and go to the school that you'd like to. But when you're in 12th grade, you can't. 13th grade, you can. And that needs to be addressed. I'm going to just play the devil's advocate here a little bit. Invested conservative families have taken their kids out of these government-run schools. They've put them oftentimes into schools like my kids are, into classical charter schools. They're getting a great education, but you're taking some of these families out of your government-run schools, your local neighborhood schools. Is the quality of education dropping? Are we seeing problems there? The funding has now left and followed my kids, because in Colorado, it does follow them to that charter school. And we do have open enrollment in Colorado, so you can choose within different government-run and neighborhood schools where your kids are going to go. But is there a problem now that that these fundings aren't going to these neighborhood schools? That these kids from these highly invested families, where you have both parents are pouring into their kids' education, going, I don't want that at the neighborhood school, so I'm going to take them out. You're removing those families, you're removing that funding from those schools. Is that going to be a long-term problem for government-run schools?
This is the main argument that's repeated over and over again by the teachers unions, and you can find the full response in the book School Choice Myths. Ben Scafferty and Marty Lucan wrote a great chapter on this in that book. But look, their main argument is that school choice will defund the public schools. That in one way or another, they'll say that school choice will siphon away money or defund the public schools, to which I will respond, school choice doesn't defund public schools. If anything, absent school choice, public schools defund families. School choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners, the students and their families. And you can take that money back to the public school if it works best for you, but you shouldn't have to take the money to the public school if it doesn't work. You should be able to take it to a private provider of the educational services. And so the money is meant for educating the child. It's not meant for propping up and protecting a particular institution, public or private. You would similarly think it would be absolutely absurd for someone to try to say that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunds Safeway. That wouldn't make any sense, because everybody understands that the money that you use on groceries doesn't belong to Safeway. It belongs to the family and whatever institution you ultimately take it to. It doesn't belong to any institution right off the bat. Similarly, with K-12 public education system, education funding, the money's for the students, not for the buildings again. So the public school teachers unions will repeat this myth. And the assumption behind it is that the money all belongs to them. It doesn't belong to the kids, but they get that absolutely backwards. And no one would ever say that Pell Grants for higher education defund community colleges just because they can be used at private religious universities. No one would say that, because people understand the Pell Grant is for the child, not for the public provider or for the community college. So it's similarly ridiculous for them to say this at the K-12 education level. But it's more absurd for two other reasons. One is that mathematically, although it's true that the public schools lose some funding based on enrollment, they're not completely funded based on enrollment counts. And with a lot of these programs, only about half of the funding actually follows the child to the private school. And that's mostly how this is done in programs across the country. What does that mean mathematically? It means that the public schools end up with more funding per student left behind. So they actually end up financially better off on a per pupil basis. And just imagine if after you left Walmart to start shopping at Trader Joe's, if Walmart got to keep 50% of your grocery bill each week, that would be a great deal for Walmart. They would be celebrating that setup. And I similarly argue that public schools should be happy they get to keep any money at all associated with a child who's no longer attending their school. Or with a private school, do private schools get to keep your tuition in perpetuity after you leave to another institution? Absolutely not. And if they did, they'd be happy if they got to keep half of your tuition after you left. So the public schools are not being defunded. If anything, they're actually better funded on a per pupil basis when they lose students to their competition through a school choice program or through a charter school, or for that matter, for any other move. If someone moves from one district to another, or does the open enrollment thing that you're talking about with district-run public schools, the same financial effect happens to the public school district because they lose the student that would have otherwise been in their school. So when politicians pay out of pocket to send their kids to private schools and then rail against school choice because it defunds the public schools, well, they defunded the public schools too when they pulled their kid out of the public school and sent them to a private school because of that enrollment-based funding in the public school system. My third response to that is that this is essentially an admission from the defenders of the status quo that they understand that families aren't really happy with what's going on in the public school system. Why would giving families a choice defund public schools? If the public schools are doing a good job, why would you lose any money at all? Why would families leave? Well, it's because they understand that families actually aren't really happy with the services that are being provided in the public school system. So the biggest argument against school choice is actually one of the best arguments for school choice. If I was a business owner and I said, oh my goodness, you being able to shop at Trader Joe's would put me out of business. Oh my God, it's horrible. That's a pretty great argument for allowing families to go elsewhere. And it's a pretty, it would be a pretty embarrassing admission for any business to actually come out and say that. Yet the public school monopoly says it over and over and over again, that they believe that whenever families are given the option, they're going to leave and there's going to be a mass exodus in the public school system. I actually have a fourth response to this, and it's something that you alluded to with competition. There are 28 studies on this topic, and 26 of the 28 studies find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition at the K-12 level on the students who remain in the traditional public schools. So in this sense, school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. The public schools, even though they're a government monopoly, respond to competitive pressures and actually up their game a little bit. They start to do better. They start to allocate their resources more efficiently. And in fact, there are 5 studies on the topic that I know of finding that in response to the same competition, whether through charter schools or private schools, the public schools start to pay their teachers more in response to that competition because they start to allocate more resources to the classroom as opposed to towards administrative bloat and staffing surges, which is great for the teachers in the system. So school choice benefits teachers too, but it's not so good for the union bosses and the administrators who would have otherwise gotten that money. So 5 studies on that topic. If you want to find it, you can Google school choice benefits teachers too, Corey DeAngelis. You'll find a table of all of those studies as well, because a lot of people it doesn't really click that school choice can be a great thing for public school teachers who happen to be union members, but not so much for the union bosses and the administrators in the system. And then also there's related to the pandemic and the school reopening debate. There's been one study that I've seen on this topic. It was a Brown University working paper by Michael Hartney, who's at Boston College, and his co-author, finding that public school districts with more low-cost private schools in the form of Catholic schools in the area were substantially more likely to reopen their doors for business, giving credibility to the argument that a lot of this has to do with competition rather than science and the needs of, and more about incentives than the science. And that's the only study that I've seen on the topic. More competition means that your public schools were more likely to reopen.
That's great. We've got time really for just one last question, and we will get some of these links. Dr. DeAngelis, if you could send this to us, we put links to these studies in the description on the YouTube channel, so you can follow up with that. That would be great. You talked a little bit about school boards and school board leaders and the challenges that they face during this pandemic. Would electing new school board members help in this effort? And how can we better support good school board members?
Yeah, that'll totally help. I mean, this is why so many families are using this as an avenue to push back when they've seen that their school board members, after surveying the parents or not surveying the parents at all, or when they did survey the parents, finding that a majority of them wanted in-person learning options, not actually giving the families those options. And instead of listening to the families, listening to the teachers unions and their desires rather than the needs of the families, there have been efforts to recall school board members. And of course, this can help. But I don't think it's the strongest form of accountability, because you might have someone that's running on, and first of all, you got to win the elections, right? That takes a lot of time and effort. And I don't think families should have to wait any longer. They should be able to access alternatives right now whenever they need to. But then two, even if you do elect the right, quote, right person, they may not be in the majority on a particular vote, and they may not do exactly what they said. They may run on one set of principles, get elected to office, and then not actually do what they said that they were going to do. And then also, if they actually do push for the policies that they ran on, it's not totally clear whether the employees in the system are actually going to do what they say. So this is a form of accountability that could help, but I think the strongest and form of accountability is bottom-up accountability, allowing families to vote with their feet by directly empowering them by funding their students directly. Because if the school's not providing what you need right now, then you could take your money elsewhere. And as I've said in the previous response to the previous question, is that the public schools will start to up their game too and respond to those competitive pressures if families have true power. And the strongest form of accountability, that bottom-up accountability, and private schools are more likely to have that. They're directly accountable to families rather than bureaucrats in the government.
Dr. DeAngelis, this has been very helpful. Thank you so much. This is something that we care deeply about. This is where the next generation of patriots for this country are educated. The next generation of leaders are educated. So we care so profoundly about what's being taught to our children, to our grandchildren. So on behalf of everybody watching, we want to thank you. I think you've given us a good vision of how these problems existed prior to COVID-19. COVID-19 really has opened up a lot of eyes to these problems, but we have a way forward. And one of the most important things that we can do is make sure that the funding follows the child so that it opens up a tremendous economy of options out there where people can choose the best school for their children. It incentivizes competition. It forces the bad schools, the bad teachers, the bad administrators out, and allows the best ones to rise up, and that benefits everybody. I'll give you the final closing word here before I do a few closing announcements.
Yeah, again, I want to say thank you to Jeff for the nice introduction and the and everything tonight, and also for the Centennial Institute for inviting me out. I want to thank everybody for coming out and participating in Q&A and watching the entire discussion. But look, again, the silver lining here is that families are finally waking up and figuring out that there's no good reason to fund institutions, particularly closed institutions, when we can fund students directly instead. And I think we're going to continue to see more momentum building for the common sense reform and solution, which is to directly empower families by funding the students as opposed to closed school buildings. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. DeAngelis. Our next Distinguished Lecture Series will be April 19th with Ilya Shapiro, one of Dr. DeAngelis's colleagues. You're not going to want to miss it. Ilya is one of the greatest scholars out there when it comes to the Supreme Court. He's very fun, and you're really going to enjoy it. He's going to be discussing his book, Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court. That'll be April 19th from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time. If you'd like to be a part of conversations like these regularly, interact with conservative scholars, and take the next step for your future, be sure to check out Colorado Christian University. It's a wonderful, wonderful university, and we want to help you really reach that next chapter of your life. So be sure to visit ccu.edu. That's ccu.edu to learn more about all the degrees that you can earn from Colorado Christian University. And with that, we'll call it a night. Thank you to everybody for being a part of our conversations this evening. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. God bless you.